When I was 16 years old, my dad was in for the battle of his life. He had cancer. About 3 months into chemo, he had negative results and things were progressing rapidly. I was heartbroken to hear we probably would not have him in our lives much longer. A month or two after stopping his chemo treatments, he was unexpectedly hospitalized and put onto a ventilator. My mom was very protective of what my brother and I witnessed about my dad's illness. There were many things that I now know happened, but she had shielded us from. This hospitalization was one of them. My mom arranged for us to stay with my aunt for a few days while she watched over our father in the hospital. She did call every few hours and had our aunt relay updates to us. After 2 days of living with my aunt and trying my best to pretend everything was all right, my father appeared to me. It was around 11 o'clock at night, and I woke up to the odd feeling that something was watching me. I was sleeping facing the window, so I rolled over to face the door. My father was standing at the side of the bed, a loving grin on his face, smiling down at me. I rubbed my sleepy eyes and told him I was so glad to see him and happy that he was all right and out of the hospital. He nodded his head, leaned down, kissed me on the forehead, and walked out of my room without saying anything. I didn't think it was strange that he hadn't replied at the time because I was still very groggy. The next morning, I got ready for school, grabbed my backpack, and ran downstairs to the kitchen to grab a quick breakfast before heading out to the bus. When I'd reached the kitchen, I noticed my entire family was sitting at the dining room table, sobbing. Obviously, because of what had happened the night before, I was in disbelief. I tried to argue with them, telling them that couldn't be because Dad was home. I'd seen him last night. In response, I only received sympathetic looks and reassurances that he had truly passed away last night. My mom and aunt promised me that it had been a dream and only a dream. I knew that I was groggy and half asleep, but I had felt his breath on my forehead when he kissed me. It had to have been real. Now I'm going to take you to another time I encountered my father after his passing. I was 17 and my mom and I were fighting. It had ended in me slamming my door and locking myself in my room so I could cry it out. My radio, which was off at the time, turned on and played my favorite song. When the song ended, the radio turned itself off. I checked the connection, the power button, and numerous other things to try to explain it. I had no answers. I truly feel like it was my dad trying to comfort me. When I was 18, I had just been dumped by my boyfriend. We had been together for over a year. In my room, I laid on my bed with swollen eyes, trying to distract myself by watching some television. My phone chimed, and it was from my ex, trying to explain his reasoning for the sudden breakup. Annoyed, I tucked my phone under my pillow. Just as I had barely laid back down on my bed, a picture of my father and I on my desk fell forward face down. It didn't shatter. I took it as my father trying to get my attention to tell me everything was going to be all right, and that he was still here for me. Although some of my experiences are minor, I find a lot of comfort in the fact that this could have been my father watching over me. I had a dream that made my blood run cold. Nothing like this has ever happened to me before in my life. I love my grandparents dearly, but with a crazy college class schedule to tend to and a part-time job, I was only able to keep in touch with them about once a month. It was a Thursday night. I had just finished a shift at the local retail store I worked at, and I was exhausted. I watched a little TV and then dozed off in bed. I only remember parts of the dream I had, but what I remember is disturbing enough. I'm standing in an empty parking lot with my grandfather. The moon is almost completely blanketed by clouds, and there is one lone streetlight about 10 yards away. From the lack of light, I can make out some of my grandfather's features, but not all of them. He is standing about 6 feet away from me with his head turned towards the black sky, glancing up at the tiny sliver of moon that can be seen. Suddenly, without notice of thunder or lightning, it just starts pouring rain. I throw my hands above my head in an attempt to shield myself from the droplets. I watch as my grandfather continues to stare up at the sky, rain running down his cheeks and drenching his short white hair. Finally, after what seems like forever, my grandfather turns to look at me. He blinks rain droplets out of his eyes and smiles, then waves. I hold my hand up and wave back. He slowly saunters over to me, scoops me up in a big hug and kisses my forehead. "You will be fine." He pulls away and searches my face for some sort of understanding. I look up at him, terrified, although I'm not sure why. "Will I be?" Again, he nods and rests his chin on the top of my head as we both are inundated by the droplets. "You know you will be." I burst out into tears that after only a moment or two become hysterical sobs. He pulls back, puts my chin in his hands, and smiles into my eyes before turning and walking in the opposite direction of the street lamp. I watch him leave, my stomach lurching with every uncontrollable sob. Once the darkness has swallowed him, I drop to my knees in the pouring rain and cry some more. At that point, I woke myself up. I was sweating and the dream lingered an echo in my ears. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to pull myself free from the dream and back to reality. Everything's okay. I'm okay. Grandpa is okay. I took a deep breath in, reached for my cell phone and checked the time. My heart stopped as my screen illuminated 3 missed calls from my grandmother. I called her back, confused and speechless. She explained that he had passed away in his sleep very suddenly. They thought it was a heart attack. I fought a lump in my throat that seemed to rise with every word she said. My heart felt like it was being torn in small shreds. My grandmother hung up and I laid there again, staring at my ceiling. This time, I let the dream wash over me and I cried silent sobs, letting everything sink in. Had my grandfather come to me in my dreams to say goodbye? To this day, I'm not sure how it was possible, but I think he did. When I was 14, my brother had gone swimming in the local river with some friends from school. It was not a place he was unfamiliar with. We both went there all the time. Unfortunately, this day, there was an accident. My brother was trying to use the rope swing to swing into the river. But when he'd grabbed the rope, it was so wet from the person who had used it before that his hands just slid right off of it. He fell onto the rocks below. He hadn't died immediately. He was taken by ambulance to the hospital and put into a medically induced coma for 2 days before we were told he was not going to make it. For days and months after the funeral, I would just cry and wish I could see him or hear him one more time. I missed him so much. One day, I had just gotten home from school, and my mom and dad were both at work, as usual. I was usually home alone for about an hour before they arrived on most days. In our living room, we have one of those love seats that manually recline. I would always sit on the left side, and my brother would sit on the right one, and we would watch our favorite shows together. On this specific occasion, I was watching my brother's favorite series. It was an entirely new season that had just started about a week prior. I had barely started the first episode of the new season, and I started to get the munchies. So I paused the show and went to the kitchen to find something good to snack on. I was rifling through the food pantry when I heard the pop sound of one of the recliner levers being pulled and reclining. At first, I thought someone might be in the house, so I grabbed the nearest knife, walked to the kitchen doorway, and slowly peered around the corner to the living room. The recliner on my brother's side was fully reclined as if someone was using it. It freaked me out something fierce for a few minutes. I walked around the house to be sure no one else was in the house, but all the doors were locked, and there was no sign of an intruder. I went back to the kitchen, grabbed a snack, put the knife away, and sat back down on the love seat. I gave his chair one last glance, nodded in what I hoped he'd know as recognition, and unpaused the show. I told my parents about what had happened when they got home from work. I was elated to think it could have been my brother. My parents, on the other hand, just dismissed it as a malfunction. A few months after, I was really having a hard time again, missing my brother to no end. Again, it was after school before my parents were home, and the phone rang only once before the answering machine clicked on. I was watching television as usual, reclining away, and then I heard what sounded like my brother's voice saying hello. I paused my show and listened, and the sound was now gone. Curious, I got up and went to the kitchen to see where the voice was coming from. I looked down and noticed the red blinking light on the answering machine and pressed play. It was my brother. There was a ton of static, but you could hear him say, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" And then more static, and the message ended. I played the message for my parents when they got home. My dad stepped backwards in shock, and my mom turned deathly white. I'm pretty sure after that incident, they believed me about my brother possibly reclining the chair. Since then, I have not heard or seen anything else. I'm still hopeful, though. When I was 17, I was dating a guy who was 19. My parents knew about it, and in fact, they loved Sean to death. Sean did have a motorcycle, which they did not allow me to ride on. Even knowing they didn't want me to ride with them, he'd still ask once in a while if I wanted to go for a ride. I don't think it only had to do with the warnings from my parents, but I always had a feeling of dread when he asked me if I wanted to ride it. I just had an overpowering bad feeling. Something in my head just said, don't do it. Don't go. So I never did. I'm really lucky I didn't. Eventually, it is what killed him. It had been raining for weeks, some days pouring massive sheets of rain. Riding a motorcycle was not the safest way to get about. One rainy morning, I was called to the office at school. I was unsure as to why I was beckoned, because I never did anything to get in trouble. When I walked into the office, the principal was waiting for me as well as the school psychologist and both of my parents. My mom looked like she had been crying. At first, I thought someone in my immediate family had died until my dad took my hand in his, sat me down, and told me that Sean had passed away in a motorcycle accident. I was beyond broken. He had been the best thing in my life. He'd even just given me a promise ring 2 weeks before on my birthday. After a few weeks, I went back to my part-time job at a local craft store. That evening, I had to help close with the manager. She'd walked me to my car and then got into her car and was talking on the phone. When I got into my car and was letting it warm up, I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was in the car with me. I checked the back seat and scanned around the parking lot, but I saw no one else besides my boss, jabbering away in her car on the phone while she slowly backed out of her parking spot. I shrugged it off as being tired, or maybe just being unnerved because I wasn't used to working this late in the evening. As I reached down and put my car in reverse, something fell from my mirror. I put my car in park and turned my interior light on and searched around to find what could have fallen. Very recently, I had placed the promise ring Sean had given me on a chain and hung it from my rearview mirror. I found it on the floorboard by my feet with the chain completely intact. I looked around my car yet again to see no one obviously around. Then, all of a sudden, an overwhelming smell wafted through my car. It was Sean's cologne. It lingered for a minute, maybe two, then subsided. The next year, when it was barely beginning to warm up to summer weather, I decided to go read my book out by our pool. I was drinking a soda and lounging on our chase. I had just turned the page and blindly reached for my can of soda on the table next to me. My fingers did not find cold aluminum, however. It was something different and unexpected. I placed my book in my lap and turned my attention to the table. There was a lone rose placed on the table right next to my soda. The same roses that were in my mom's garden. I scanned the backyard for the sign of anyone, to no avail. Then, once again, there was the overwhelming smell of Sean's cologne. It seemed to surround me in an aromatic hug and then faded. I sat there in shock on the chase, staring intently at my mom's prized rose bushes and the few stems that seemed to waver in the wind. Except there was no wind. My mother, Elena, suffered from epilepsy. She had it as long as I could remember. Now grown and on my own, I felt it was my duty to take her in and keep an eye on her. You never knew when she would have a seizure, and there's no known cure for it. Some people are lucky and only have it occur for a few years, while others have it their entire lives. My mom was an unfortunate case. It was around 2 in the morning, and a clatter coming from my mother's room woke me up. Hastily, I ran to investigate. My mother was tangled in her bedding, obviously having a seizure and suffocating. I did my best to untangle her while dialing 911. I performed CPR on her until paramedics arrived. Once they were in the house, I felt like I was in an ant farm. People were running here and shuffling there. I was shoved out of the way so they could work on her. I was numb, delirious, and numb. I sat on the bottom stair, which was right outside her bedroom, and just stared off into space. The only thought I could recollect is, this better not be how it ends. This cannot be how it ends. After a few minutes, which almost felt like hours, paramedics got her breathing again. Immediately, they transported her to the hospital. I stayed behind to get dressed. I was still in my boxers with no shirt on. In my room, still numb, fumbling through my drawers for something quick and easy to throw on, the phone rang. It was my aunt. I answered thoughtlessly, still exhausted. She was breathless and sounded groggy. "Jake, you will not believe the dream I just had. I had a dream that I was on a boat with your mother. We were sailing off into the golden bright sunset, and then she turned to me and told me she was dead. It felt so real." I choked on her words and just sat there in silence. I stared at the wall in front of me. I knew. Well, I was pretty sure I knew. This was too much of a coincidence to not have some truth. I told her what had just happened, and she agreed to meet me at the hospital immediately. I tugged on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and drove in a blur to the hospital. As I expected, the doctor was waiting for me when I arrived. His facial expression told me all I needed to know. She was gone. The chaplain escorted my aunt and I to a room and to console us. I know I was supposed to feel better after talking with him, but I didn't. I sat there with my elbows on my knees, my head in my hands, and tried to stay calm. I tried to make sense of the words being directed at me, but I felt like I was trying to understand Charlie Brown's teacher. None of it made sense. I didn't get home until around 6 in the morning. The horizon was already peeking light throughout the valley. I threw my keys in my key dish and landed with a belly flop on the couch. There was no need to sleep in my bed. This would do just fine. I grabbed the blanket off the back of the couch and tucked myself under it, as if hiding from the world would shield the pain I was feeling. The absolute shock and loss were overwhelming my entire body. Soon, I drifted off. I dreamt of an ocean. The water's edge was highlighted by golden sunlight. It was beautiful. Birds cawed in the distance, and the lapping noises of the ocean were soothing. I was on a boat. The boat. My aunt's boat. My mom sat next to me, smiling, watching me mesmerized by the water and the sky. She put the back of her hand up and grazed my cheek. "I guess you know," she said, and stared off into the sunset. "I guess I know," I replied. My mom passed away from cancer. It wasn't a surprise. We watched her struggle to beat it for years. But finally, it had taken over everything, and there was nothing left to fight. My paranormal story begins at the age of 12. The house felt like emptiness. There wasn't a room you could walk into that wasn't heavy with underlying depression or pain. No one was sleeping well. None of us had much of an appetite either. We just lived. We went on about our days until the funeral, mostly like zombies. You wouldn't dare mention the upcoming funeral for fear my father would break down into a sobbing pile on the floor. With my sister, every time anyone spoke to her, she ran off sobbing and slammed her bedroom door. We were an absolute depressive mess of a family. On the day of the funeral was when it happened. It was time for us to get on with our lives and pull out of this dark hole of grief. I wondered if it was my mom shaking us back into reality or something. Like we needed a wake-up call. After the funeral, my father was driving us home. All of our eyes were swollen and stinging. Our nerves were on edge, and our hearts were numb. I remember looking out the window as we drove, seeing a certain store or recognizing a road sign. I thought to myself about the many times I had driven past these landmarks with my mom in the car. There would no longer be a mom in my life, let alone in the car with me. Then it happened. My dad swears he didn't fall asleep at the wheel. He said something ran across the road, but no one found evidence of anything running across the road or being hit. The car swerved and smacked into a tree. I was ejected from the vehicle. For moments or minutes, I was out. When I came to, I heard a truck blaring its horn and someone pulling me by my arms out of the road. The sun was glaring right into my eyes, but I could have sworn it was my mom. She looked happy and healthy, like mom again. The mom I hadn't had in my life for several years. I remember, amongst the pain in my shoulder and the road rash on my side, an absolute feeling of tranquility. It was as if an aura of healing, warmth, and so much love just emitted off of her and onto me. Then, everything went black again. I woke up in the hospital. My father had been pinned in the car, but only broken a leg. My sister had a minor concussion. I, on the other hand, had a fractured collarbone, dislocated shoulder, and some pretty substantial road rash on my entire left side of my body. I was lucky. It could have been much worse. A long-haul truck had been driving along the road where we crashed, and because the accident occurred on a curve, he hadn't had the time to stop right away. Paramedics talked to me briefly at the scene, most of which was a complete blur because I was in and out of consciousness. I told them about my mom and her pulling me off of the road. As a result, the first responders had searched the woods for her, thinking she must have been thrown from the car as well. It wasn't until my dad spoke to them that they stopped searching. They figured I was in shock because we had just left my mother's funeral. The odd thing is that, while I would like to believe it was a dream, the truck driver described to police that a woman pulled me off the road right before he would have hit me. I read the report, and he described my mom down to the dress we buried her in. So you tell me, did my mom pull me off of that road and save my life? I've been living in this town for about 2 years now. For the last year or so, I've been feeling a strange uneasiness when I'm in my house, but also when I'm just out and about in town, almost as though it's following me. At night, I usually hear the sound of my floorboards creaking, as though there is someone walking across the floor. Even when I'm alone in the house, I've seen shadows and dark silhouettes on my walls, even when there is no light to produce them. And I've heard things banging on my doors and from inside of the cupboard in my room, when I'm certain nothing could be causing it. All of this activity has been happening since I moved in reoccurring intervals. There hasn't been a moment where it stopped for more than a short period of time. Ever since I was little, I've had this feeling of being watched by something I could never see. These feelings of uneasiness have haunted me even before I moved into this house. Although it had never been as bad as it is now. I remember having terrible nightmares when I was younger, and I would often wake up screaming in the middle of the night, terrified of something I couldn't see. The nightmares only got worse over time. So in general, I've had strange experiences my whole life, though I've never really understood what any of it was. Back to the present, a friend of mine has been having strange experiences of her own. She used to be a big fan of dolls and has grown up around them since she was a baby. It's only recently that she has lost her love for them and is trying to sell them off. But there is one particular doll that has, undoubtedly, a creepy aura around her. Something just feels off about her. And my friend recently told me that she has seen the doll moving on its own. On a few occasions, she's even seen the doll peeking its head around her bedroom door to watch her sleep. And the doll has sometimes been heard screaming and wailing for no apparent reason, and it shouldn't even be able to make sound. For the past week or so, I've been looking after this doll. The room where my friend has been keeping all the dolls she's selling is getting too cramped. This one is a pretty big doll, and she told me she wanted a break from all the disruption that the doll has been causing her, so I offered to look after it for a few days. The doll has been staying in my room since then, and while I was beginning to doubt there was anything wrong with it after all, that changed a few days ago. I decided to set up the camera on my phone to record the doll while I wasn't in my room, just on the off chance I caught her doing anything out of the ordinary. To my disappointment, she didn't move at all in the video I took. But after watching it half a dozen times, I paid careful attention to her face and noticed that at the start of the video, just as I left to go downstairs and turned off the light, her eye went blood red. Her normal eye color is bluey green. When I came back up, half an hour later to check on her, her eye was back to its normal color. 2 nights before this, I had woken up in the middle of the night to the feeling of something pressing me down into my bed. At the time, It had been too dark to see what or who it was. When I tried to turn my bedside light on so that I could see, I couldn't move my arms. They were being held down by something. What creeped me out the most, however, was the feeling of hair dangling down onto my face. My legs felt numb, and for some reason, they were too heavy to lift. I couldn't move anything. It didn't help that, at the time, I was ill and feeling physically quite weak and tired. I fear that my weakness made me an easy target for whatever was in my house at that time. I don't remember what happened afterwards, but at some point, I must have fallen back asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I discovered an ugly bruise on my arm that hadn't been there before, in the exact same place where I had been held down. I was pretty shaken up by the experience, and I immediately told my friend what had happened. She was just as freaked out as I was. Anytime my friend or I look at the doll, it almost feels as though the energy is being drained from our bodies. It renders me physically weak and tired. While my friend has been feeling like that for years, this is a first time for me. And now, I'm certain that there's something wrong with the doll, after all. The day was Wednesday, 21st, February 2018. I had been fighting a cold that wouldn't go for the past 2 months, and that evening I fixed myself some medication. I carried a glass of water to my room to take the meds with, and once I was finished, I put the glass down on the chest of drawers by my bed. The drawers themselves weren't very tall, and my room had a thick carpet. During the night, I was woken up suddenly to the sound of glass shattering. The noise startled me, and I laid there with my heart thudding in my chest, wondering what I had heard. I started to think I had merely dreamt the noise, since the house was so still and silent. After a few minutes of trying to calm myself down and hearing nothing else, I eventually went back to sleep. The next thing that woke me up was my alarm the following morning. I turned it off and swung my legs over the bed, putting my feet down to where my flip-flops were waiting, where I had left them the night before. I had my feet in the shoes before I reached out to switch the lamp on, since it was still pretty dark. As soon as the light came on, I was overcome with an intense feeling of shock. Less than half an inch from my right foot was the base of a shattered glass. The same one I had put on the table last night after taking my medicine. There was an incredibly sharp piece of glass sticking up from the carpet, almost like an inverted dagger, right next to my ankle. The base of the glass was upright next to it, and all of the glass had completely shattered, laying around it. What unnerved me the most was how it had happened. It didn't make any sense to me. There was no plausible explanation for why the glass would have moved off the chest of drawers by itself and shattered on the thick carpet in such a way that all the shards had landed around the base. Never mind that single piece of glass that was sticking up towards me. Being careful to avoid the glass, I went and told my mom what had happened. That's when she told me that something weird had happened to her during the night as well. She said that she'd woken up at some point to the feeling that someone had crawled onto the bed with her and had pinned her down. She told me she was still half dreaming at the time, but when she looked up, she was staring at the grotesque, mangled face of a little girl. She said it was horrible to look at, but she was sure that whatever the thing was, it was malicious and wanted to hurt her. Because she was still semi-asleep, she began to dream that I had walked into the room, and the face of the little girl changed into that of a normal, pretty child. Then, as soon as I left, the face changed again to become ugly and grotesque. The girl, or whatever it was, shook her around the bed for a few minutes before it finally left. She was so freaked out. By the time the thing started shaking her, she was completely awake and aware of what was happening. After that, she barely slept for the next 5 days, terrified it would happen again. I began to notice scratches appearing on my arms, too. They were thin and jagged, almost like cat scratches, even though we don't have any pets. On the following Thursday and Friday, I also noticed strange red marks appearing on my neck, like pressure marks that just wouldn't go away. I knew for certain that nobody was anywhere near my room at the time, so I have no idea what could have caused them. I tried asking one of my friends for help and explained to him everything that had happened. He told me that it sounded like someone had brought something dark into the house, and whatever it was had somehow fixated on me. I thought that my mom had gotten off much worse, though, so I don't understand how it could be attached to me. A new chapter in my life had begun. I was officially a homeowner. Really, I had been so for nearly a month now. But the house hadn't yet truly felt like it was quite mine yet. With the table in my trunk, I would be putting the finishing touches on the decor that would transform the house from an empty shell to my home. I turned onto my street and drove about halfway down the block to where I now lived. Even after a month, I still had yet to meet any of my neighbors, not officially anyways. It wasn't like they weren't close by. They just seemed to keep their distance, only giving me sideways glances or peeking at me from behind their partially drawn curtains. It didn't bother me, though. Some communities were very close, and it took time to break into their circles. I had plenty of time. Once I drove into the garage, I unloaded the table and hauled it into the house, pressing the button to close the garage door on the way in. The spot that the table would go had already been picked out and cleared, so it didn't take me too long to get it situated, and my personal possessions set atop its surface. I appreciated my work with the table. It appeared just as I had imagined in my head when I first discovered it for sale online. I still couldn't get over how I had picked it up for only $50. Things like this could cost you thousands of dollars, and the person seemed either not to know what they had or were just looking for a quick sale. I had felt a little guilty when I had left with my treasure, but the man had been adamant about getting rid of it. His loss and my gain, I suppose. The rest of the day was very quiet, consisting of some light cleaning, eating dinner, and watching some television. Basically the average night for me. Sometime around 9:30, I was getting tired and decided to turn in for the evening. I had just turned down the covers on my bed and went to the bathroom to brush my teeth when I heard what sounded like footsteps walking through the halls. I quickly turned off the sink to allow me to hear better, but as soon as the water went off, the sound seemed to stop completely. Shrugging, I assumed it might be a loose pipe somewhere and resolved to call a plumber the next day to have it checked out. Oddly enough, The noise didn't seem to start back up when I turned the knob on the sink once more, but in the month that I had been there already, I'd never heard anything amiss. Finishing up my bathroom routine, I climbed into bed and prepared to go to sleep. That's when the footsteps started again. I was supposed to be alone in the house, so the sound of footsteps sent a chill down my spine. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling in its foundation, or the residual movement of the pipe from the bathroom, but I knew better. It was definitely someone walking. The movement seemed to be coming from the living room, where I had just been a few minutes before. The thought that someone had been here the entire evening watching me whilst I was unaware was even more disturbing than the idea that someone had broken into my home. Now that I was sure I wasn't alone, the question was, what was I going to do about it? Do I stay quiet and hide somewhere in the house, or do I confront my intruder? My mind screamed for me to hide, but I wasn't about to allow someone to stain my thoughts of my new home. It probably wasn't the best option to give away my presence, but after the words left my mouth, there was no taking them back. "Hello? Is someone there?" I thought that I had surprised whoever was out there when the walking stopped suddenly. "I'm going to call the police, so you'd better leave right now," I yelled, suddenly emboldened. With that, the walking started coming in my direction. Knowing the threat I'd made was a mistake, I grabbed the edge of my covers, trying to hide from whoever was coming towards me. Every creak of the floorboard brought them closer and closer. A knot of fear constricted in my stomach as I saw the beginning of a shadow come into view through my door. I wanted to close my eyes, hoping that shielding my eyes would somehow protect me. I strained to close them, but I was unable to pull my gaze from the opening. The shadow stretched farther on the wall, and the sound of the steps were getting louder and louder. A couple more steps, and they would be outside my door. I tried to take a breath, but I felt like I was choking on the air itself. I heard 1, 2, 3 more steps, and the shadow seemed to pass by my door without someone appearing. Yet the sound seemed to have moved on by continuing down the hallway. Had I missed them? Had they missed me? Neither option seemed very likely. I slid my way out from under the covers and stood on unsteady legs. Slowly, I made my way to the door. Every step of my own seemed to sound 100 times louder than it probably was. I kept reminding myself that this was my house, and I had to protect it. I tried to find some sort of weapon to protect myself, but nothing stood out that would do much good. I would just have to hope that the other person didn't have a gun or a knife. Whoever it was seemed to have stopped at the end of the hall. I edged around the frame of the door, trying to get a peek at my assailant, but the shadows concealed them from view. The element of surprise was on their side as long as the lights were off. I had to do something to change the balance. The switch for the hall was a few steps away. If I could just make it there before they realized what I was planning to do, then maybe I could take them by surprise, even scare them off in doing so. I steadied my legs and rushed forward. As soon as I left the room, I heard footsteps pounding down the hall in pursuit of me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the switch, sure that it was too late. that I had botched my chance. Moments before the intruder was on me, I flipped the lights on and turned, expecting them to crash into me. Instead, I was met by an empty hallway. I was alone. The idea that everything that had happened was in my head seemed impossible. Sure, I was alone here, but I wasn't crazy. The sounds had been unmistakable. Someone else was here. I made my way down to the end of the hall, hoping to catch someone hiding there. The only place someone could be was in the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was closed, so I flung the door open as hard and as fast as I could. "Who's there?" I yelled. A cold gust of air seemed to blow past me, causing me to look towards the window, expecting to see it open where someone had escaped. The thing was, though, that the window was shut, and upon inspection locked. That left only one place for someone to be: the closet. Angrier than scared at this point, I marched over to the door and flung it open, ready to put an end to this game. Nothing. There was no way someone could have gotten by me undetected, so I was at a loss. I stood there, turning in a slow circle, trying to see if I could have overlooked something to no effect. There was most definitely no one but me in the room. Then, they started again. The footsteps, moving down the hall towards the living room. It was as if whoever was there was mocking me by being so obvious about their presence. As I made my way out the door, the sound of something crashing to the ground removed any doubt that I hadn't been imagining the whole thing. I quickened my pace, pushing myself forward. Exiting the hall, I saw my new table laying on its side. The things I had placed upon it scattered on around the floor. It had only been a few seconds, yet the room was empty, and the sound of someone walking had stopped. Looking over my belongings, it didn't appear that anything was broken. Even the table seemed to have suffered no damage. Reaching down to pick it up, I noticed the underside of it for the first time. Strange symbols had been carved into the wood. Symbols I didn't recognize. Just the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. Wanting to put the odd markings out of view, I righted the table and arranged the ornamentations back in their respective positions. Still, I couldn't quite get the image of those markings out of my head. I searched the entirety of the house, but found no trace of anyone there but myself. The rest of the night was quiet. No footsteps came, and sometime after 1 o'clock, exhaustion overcame my unease, and I fell asleep. Over the next few days, there were a number of occasions where I would find the things on top of the table seemed to have been brushed off its surface, or the table itself being knocked over just as it had been the first evening I had brought it home. I tried to ignore the thoughts that were creeping into my head, that were telling me something had come into my home with it. I heard of objects having things attached to them, but I refused to believe that is what was going on, even though there wasn't really any other explanation. Finally, after nearly a week, I couldn't take it anymore. The table had to go. I packed it into my car and took it to a second-hand store where I could leave it as a donation. Immediately after returning home, it felt as if a lightness had come over the house. Whatever energy was attached to that table was removed when I took the table out. I just hope it doesn't find its way back.